Hey, good morning, kids. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you guys are in this world. I hope you guys are having a very calm and peaceful day. So we are on chapter 4. We're about halfway there. So now we're going to start talking about the more advanced concepts. So we have our solid base. We have our solid foundation. So now it's time to build on that foundation with more advanced grammar concepts. So these are still going to be grammar concepts. Like, for example, you guys all have heard of verbs before, right? Verbs, that verb is a grammar concept. And so just the way that we're going to talk about or teach verbs is going to be very different or very unlike any other sort of grammar class you've ever taken. I imagine. So the way that I think most students are accustomed to learning verbs is just by learning verb tenses, right? So you learn about the different verb tenses and the uses, and then you're done. And then they're like, okay, well, you graduated, so go ahead and now you're off in the real world, and now you get to kind of use verb tenses in whatever way that you like, right? Well, although that's one way to teach and learn verbs, I think that the more effective way to learn verbs is to have a system of thinking, right? Is to have a system of thinking around verbs. So the way that I like to think about verbs and the way that I like to teach my students to think about verbs is by thinking about verbs in 3 different ways, okay? So they're not just verb tenses that we should know, but we should learn specific concepts or subtopics about verbs. So even though we have the concept of verbs that we're going to focus on, within this focus, we're going to talk about 3 separate buckets, right? 3 separate subtopics or subconcepts of verbs. So one of those is going to be the subject-verb agreement. And this concept is a very commonly tested concept in high school entrance exams, as well as the college entrance exams like the SAT and the ACT. So this stuff appears a lot on standardized tests. Also on the GMAT, when they used to test for grammar. We also have verb forms and we have verb tenses. So these are going to be the various ways to create our system of thinking around verbs. And this is also your visual model for you to remember the verbs, right? So you can think about verbs in these 3 subtopics, these 3 buckets, right? SVA, verb forms, and verb tenses. So each video is going to focus on one of these concepts, and throughout the series, throughout the next 7 or 8 videos, we'll learn pretty much, right, 99% of what you need to know about verbs. So we'll start off with subject-verb agreement. Let's go ahead and jump into this one, you guys. So the way that we'll talk about this is we'll talk about the definition, so what this means, as well as some of the principles, right? Some of the principles about this concept, and then some tips about how to think through and how to work through subject-verb agreement questions, or when you're writing sentences, how to think through writing these the proper way. So in terms of, well, first of all, subject-verb agreement, right? I'm going to call this shorthand for, I'm going to use shorthand, the shorthand SVA, right, when I'm talking about subject-verb agreement. So what exactly is it? So the concept is very simple. So the concept just means that the subject must agree with its verb in number. Right, so in other words, or to be specific, singular subjects such as the book, a car, Bob, right? So singular subjects just refer to like one thing, right? One thing, one person, one place. So singular subjects take on singular verbs. So for example, we would say the book is, right? A car runs, Bob has. Right, so singular subjects take singular verbs, and plural subjects like the books, the cars, or people take plural verbs. Right, so we would say the books are, the cars run, people have. Right, so the subject and its verb has to agree or match in number. And so your objective is basically, when you're answering these types of questions for the SAT or the ACT, your objective is very simple, right? Choose the answer whose subject and verb matches in number. when you're writing sentences or writing essays, your job is to make sure that the subject that you're writing matches the verb, right? And that might be a little bit harder than you might think, because there are tricky ways, or there are kind of things that are confusing, right, about this concept the more we dive deep into it. So some general principles. Some general principles about subject-verb agreement that I think are really helpful to know. So when we'll cover this, but we'll use this example sentence. Let's call this an example passage. We'll call this an example passage, and we'll use this example passage to talk about the principles. Okay? So the passage reads, Bob eats pizza every Friday. It is his cheat day. Why he calls it a cheat day has been a mystery to Anna since 2018. So the first principle here is that a subject, right? Because we are talking about subject-verb agreement. So to break that down, we have to understand subjects, right? So a subject usually appears at the beginning or near the beginning of a sentence, right? So circle that. It's at or near the beginning of a sentence. Remember that, right? When you're identifying independent clauses in sentences, when you're reading for grammar, you can identify the subject, right? You know that that's going to appear at or near the beginning of a sentence. It's usually the case. We also know that a subject can be a noun. So for example, Bob is the subject here. It can also be a pronoun. So for example, it is the subject here. Or it can be what's called a noun equivalent, right? So it's something that stands for or represents a noun. So for example, this noun clause, why he calls it a cheat day, this is a type of dependent clause. So that's equals to a noun, right? Because a noun clause can be used as a subject in a sentence, and that's how it's being used in this sentence, in the passage. A noun can be a person, place, thing, an event, or an idea, right? Something a little bit more concrete, like Bob is a concrete person, concrete thing. A place is also concrete, right? Like the library, although we can have like places that are a little bit more abstract, like the mind. A thing is tangible, it's concrete, right? Like a screen. Oh, whoa, that's pretty cool. I haven't done that before. So like a pen, a remote controller. These are things. They're concrete. They're tangible. An event could be something that's a little bit more abstract, right? Or an idea. An idea is abstract by definition, right? An idea could be something like love or justice. Right? Fairness, these are going to be ideas, yeah? They're more abstract concepts. Also, it's important to know, you guys, that singular nouns, right? Singular nouns usually don't end in S, right? So unless the S is part of the base word, so for example, like bus, the S is part of the base word, so it ends in the S. The United States, my boss, right? These are examples of singular nouns that end in an S. But these are singular, right? Most nouns, though, don't end in S, right, when they're singular. So for example, we can say person, a place, Bob, a book, a car, an animal, a dog, a cat, so on and so forth, right? Pizza, box. These are going to be things that don't end in S. And we know that singular nouns as subjects in a sentence take singular verbs, right? So we want to make sure that they agree in number, okay? We also know, good. So looking at these other principles here, right? Plural nouns. So yeah, this example here was to really take a look at or understand singular subjects and singular nouns. Here we're going to take a look at a little bit more of the plural things, right? The plural things. So we have another example paragraph. It says, Bob and Anna study together every Sunday. they meet at their school library. Reading the course textbook and discussing their ideas reinforce what they know and what they don't know. Okay, so another principle to keep in mind about SVA is plural nouns as subjects in a sentence. So for example, Bob and Anna, this is going to be your subject in the sentence. That's going to be a plural noun because it refers to more than one person, right? So Bob and Anna, referring to two people. It's plural. They is also a plural subject. They is a plural pronoun. And also reading the course textbook and discussing their ideas, right? This is also going to be a plural subject. So plural subjects take on plural verbs, right? So we want to say Bob and Anna study, they meet, and then reading and discussing reinforce, right? So what you want to make sure to do here, right? This is the seventh principle, and I think this is the most important one. So everything else was just like building up to this point here. To determine subject-verb agreement, you always want to identify the simple subject. Circle the simple subject, you guys. You don't want to identify the complete subject, right? Although you should start by identifying the complete subject, and then you really want to look for or determine the simple subject within that complete subject, right? So remember that the complete subject is the entire noun phrase that makes up the subject of the sentence, right? So for example, the list of items is considered your complete subject, and within that complete subject, you have a simple subject. The simple subject is going to be the word that comes before, like modifiers, right? It comes before prepositional phrases. It comes before dependent clauses. It comes before other types of phrases as well, right? Like present participle phrases, past participle phrases, so on and so forth, right? So the list here would be your simple subject. And because the list is a singular subject, we know that is, right, has to be a singular verb, right? So we have to make sure to match subject and verb. But look at what's tricky about this. This is what a lot of students get confused by, right? Because right before the verb, there's a plural noun, right? Items, you know? And so a lot of students think that the verb should be are because they think the subject is plural. But what you have to understand here is that these modifiers, right? Items is a part of a prepositional phrase. And a prepositional phrase will never include the main subject, right, of the sentence. So in other words, the main subject of the sentence is going to be your simple subject. And your simple subject will never be found inside of a prepositional phrase or other types of modifiers. Okay? So this is why it's important to find the simple subject, right, within the complete subject. It's not that you can choose any word. It's not any word within the subject that can count as the subject of the sentence. It can't, right? It's always going to be the simple subject, right? The word that comes before prepositional phrases, other types of modifiers like dependent clauses, relative clauses, so on and so forth. Okay? So the thing that you have to know here about subject SVA is that this concept is going to come up, we're only going to look at this concept with what are called third-person subjects, right? Third person. So if you guys are used to, or if you guys have heard of like first person, second person, third person, right? We have first person singular, second person singular, third person singular. Right? We have first person plural, second person plural, third person plural, right? We're only going to look at third person, right? So first person would be like I, second person would be like you, third person would be like he, she, it, Bob, the boy, the car, the school, the bag, the bottle, the can, so on and so forth, right? Well, we're only going to look at third person subjects, either singular or plural, right? So for example, he, the class, papers, they, right? And we're going to take a look only at, present tense verbs, okay? And that's because present tense verbs, that's the verb that will change depending on whether you have a singular or a plural subject, right? So for example, if I say he eats, right, that's singular subject's going to match the singular verb. But if I use a plural subject, they, then I'm going to change the verb to eat, right? So I would say he eats, I would say they eat. I say he is, I say they are. I wouldn't say they is or he are, right? So we're going to look at, right, third person subjects and present tense verbs, and that's how we're going to take a look at, right, subject verb agreement, this concept. Also, it's important to note that first person and second person, right? So first person singular is I, first person plural is we, and the second person you. Like these subjects will behave differently, right? And you guys are used to this because you guys are, especially the first person and the second person, because that's how we communicate with each other, right? With your friends. So you say, I am tall. I am Korean. You are nice, right? You are smart, right? You would just say it like that, right? And so you know how to form the subject and the verb for these types of subjects. So we're not going to really focus on this, okay? And also, it's important to note that for the majority of past tense and future tense verbs, the verb form stays the same, right? This is going to be, so for example, if you have the past tense verb had, you would say he had and they had, right? So there's no subject verb agreement there for past tense verbs. You say he will and they will, right? So it's the same thing. The only exception is when you use the to be verb. So when you say, so the past tense of is was, right? And the past tense of are is were, right? So was is singular and were is plural, right? But for other past tense and future tense verbs, the verb stays the same, right? The form stays the same regardless of if you have a singular subject or a plural subject, okay? So taking a look at this table here, you guys, this table is for singular and plural subjects, yeah, and verbs. So remember, we're only looking at the third person subjects and present tense verbs, okay? So this column here has our subject type. And remember, this is in the third person, right? So here we would have a singular subject, right, for regular nouns, right? So regular nouns would be like student or car or book. The reason why we call them regular is when we turn a singular noun, like the student, into a plural one, all we do is add the S to make it a plural subject, right? That's why they're called regular nouns, is that they behave regularly, right? They behave normally. They behave in a predictable fashion when we turn them into plural subjects. So we also have plural regular subjects. We can have singular irregular subjects in the third person, and then we can have plural irregular subjects in the third person. So the noun the man, right, is considered an irregular noun because we don't just add the S to make it plural, right? We say the men, right? We wouldn't say the mans. And so that's why they're called irregular nouns. So here, if you think about it, we have two different types of subjects, right? We have subjects that are regular nouns and subjects that are irregular nouns. And then we have two different levels, right? We have singular subjects and we have plural subjects, okay? So this column here tells you the correct verb form. So for example, if we look at this cell here, we're looking at the correct verb form for plural regular nouns, such as the students. So we would say the students study, right? We would say the man eats, the student studies, the men eat, right? And then this column here is going to be useful. This is what I call an ear check, like an ear test. So sometimes students get really confused about whether, they should use, whether the verb is singular or plural, especially when you have subjects that they're unfamiliar with, like words that they're not familiar with as subjects. So a simple way, or a way to make this simple, is to use he or they in front of a verb, right? Because you can then better hear whether the verb is singular or plural, right? Because you're familiar with he or they much more than a word like laboratory or experimentations, right? Or species, So because you're more familiar with these types of words, it makes it easier to hear whether the verb is singular or plural. So for example, do you say he studies or do you say they studies? Of course you say he studies, right? So because he is a singular subject, you know that studies is your singular verb form, right? Do you say he plays or do you say they plays? Well, you say he plays, right? So you know that plays is going to be, right, a singular verb. And you can just do that for any sort of verb, right, to figure out if it's going to be singular or plural. It's a good little tip. Okay. Cool, you guys. So that'll do it for this lesson, right? So the concept itself is going to be very straightforward for subject-verb agreement. Remember, it's just singular subjects have to take singular verbs, and plural subjects take plural verbs, right? The difficulty is going to come when you add complexity, right? You make things a lot more complex, and there's a lot of different ways to make this concept, right, trickier or harder to handle, and that's what we'll take a look at in the next lesson. So again, you guys, fantastic job. Take a moment or so before you turn off the video to think about what you learned that was meaningful for you. It can be something new that you learned, or something that you learned that you kind of knew, but now you know a little bit better. Okay, and so just make sure you understand the conceptual things. Make sure that you just understand it at a conceptual level, and then we'll go ahead and practice our knowledge, right, or apply our knowledge in the next lesson. So again, you guys, keep up the great work. Always stay focused on the learning. You guys got this. Take care.